break it down into a church, like a church member, because some people are extremely intimidated by this. They think it's not for them, but it is. It really is, because you're helping people name their worlds. You actually allude to that with Adam in the garden when he has to name the animals. Why is that such an important thing for people to see in their understanding of culture now?
Well, I suppose to name something is to make it visible. You know, language is really powerful, isn't it? The words that we use to talk about life shape our sense of life, shape our sense of what's possible and what's good and what's bad. And so language matters. And I think, therefore, for Christians, the language we use to talk about our world will determine what we think of it and how we live in it. And so we want always to be seeking to use biblical language and biblical categories when we engage with our world. Not necessarily to talk to people who have no biblical background, because that might not make a huge lot of sense to begin with. But in our own thinking, we always want to try and begin with biblical categories, because otherwise you're eating at a table that's been set by contemporary culture with its menu, its categories, its language, and that may or may not be biblical. But you want to let the Bible set its own table, and say, well, if we were to strip it down and begin with only biblical language, how would we talk about what's going on? And I think there's real value in that exercise, because it makes you look at things afresh, and it makes you question the commonplaces and the linguistic habits that we've got into to describe our world. Travis, can I jump back? I know this is probably not
Sure.
what you're supposed to do in a podcast, but can I jump back to my previous answer? Because I'm
Sure.
thinking, what are people going to think when they hear me talking about let's get over these dichotomies? And I think there's one way that could be misheard that I think is really, really dangerous. And I just want to try and correct it. So I was saying in the previous response, let's try and mediate, or let's try and sort of get past these dichotomies. And I can hear a Christian sort of screaming at her radio or at her smartphone at this point. Well, hold on. The Bible is full of dichotomies, like heaven and hell, for example, God and creation. Like, you can't get rid of all dichotomies, because then you've got rid of the Bible. And first of all, yes, absolutely. But secondly, I think it's therefore becomes a question of where your fundamental dichotomies are. So Christianity, absolutely, biblical Christianity is founded on some basic dichotomies. Like, there's God and then there's everything else. The creator-creature distinction, as theologians call it, that's a dichotomy. You don't mix those. And secondly, the final destination of, as Augustine would say, the two cities, the eternal destruction and eternal life. That's a hard dichotomy. But what that means for the Christian is that within the cyclum, within these days in which we now live before the final judgment, there can be and is nuance and no hard dichotomies. And that can only be true for the Christian because our dichotomies find themselves outside of the here and now. The creator-creature distinction is not a feature of late modern culture, for example. And we're not yet at that moment of final division and dividing the sheep from the goats. And what that means is that everything that I encounter in culture today is going to be a mixture. There's going to be some good in it, because the beauty of creation and being made in the image of God hasn't utterly been erased. It's been palimpsestically written over by sin and obscured and twisted by sin, but it hasn't been completely erased. But neither is anything in this world here and now utterly and exhaustively evil in every possible way that it could be. So everything's a mixture. But it's only a mixture on the basis of those fundamental dichotomies that structure it. And the reason that that's important for the Christian is that I can have a working sense of good and evil, but I don't have to find them in the here and now. I don't have to find my measure for what's good and evil here and now. And so I can find nuance in culture. Not that everything is 50-50, not that everything is half good and half bad, but everything's a mixture in the last days. because, you know, as Christ himself says, nothing is good, no one is good but God alone. And therefore no human institution is utterly, you know, we've seen this in the church in recent years, haven't we? That the church, insofar as it is a human institution, is a flawed institution. Yeah, and many of its leaders have shown themselves to be profoundly flawed. Everything's mixed in this present age. But that doesn't mean that I have to say, well, everything's just relative and there's no good and evil at all, because I have dichotomies that are outside the current cultural moment. The problem is if you don't have the creator-creature distinction, and if you don't have a final judgment, then you have to find your measure for what's good and evil in the present age. Otherwise, you don't have a measure for what's good and evil, and you do become, you know, the relativist for whom every position is just as good as every other. That's where your dichotomies come in. So it's in a sense you're making immanent, you're making here and now the basic structure of good and evil that Christians find outside the here and now. And that's one reason, I think, why, for example, our politics is so dichotomized, because people are investing it with this ultimate religious significance, and they're getting their measure for what is good and evil from within the political world in a way that Christians don't have to do and shouldn't do if we've read the Bible carefully enough, because we'll know that there is a measure for good and evil, but it's not riveted into a particular political party of any stripe in this world. Doesn't mean they're all 50-50, half good, half bad. You know, there's still differences, and you can still say, I much prefer this party to the other. But it does mean that none of them gives me my measure for what is good and evil. So that's the rather labored footnote that I wanted to give. We do have dichotomies, but they're very different to the sort of dichotomies that are ripping our society apart at the moment. And Christians can only have nuance in our engagement with contemporary dichotomies because we have these other fundamental dichotomies that structure our view of the world.